Boldwood presents No Son of Mine, written by Claire Swatman and read by Antonia Beamish. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. The arrogant smirk was all it took for the red mist to descend. I barreled into his chest as hard as I could. As we collided, I raised my fist, but before I could smash it down onto his face, a blinding pain ripped through my shoulder. He'd twisted my arm behind my back. "Who sent you?" he hissed, his spittle spraying my cheek. "No one," I managed, against the agonizing roar of tearing muscles. He pulled tighter. More pain shot through me. A scream, visceral, raw, came from deep inside me. I tried to push him away, but he was much stronger than me. His other hand snaked around my throat. Panic flared. I couldn't breathe. He was going to kill me. Summoning all my remaining strength, I reached behind me with my free arm, struck something solid, folded my fingers round it, lungs burning, vision blurring. Then, from somewhere, I found one last surge of fury and swung my arm. Crack! A beat of silence. Air rushed back into my lungs, the pain in my arm dulled. Dazed, I turned round, watched as his body fell in slow motion and he hit the floor with another crack. Silence followed. Total, smothering silence. I stood still, paralysed, chest burning. I inched forward, leaned over the figure lying prone on the hearth, a marionette with his strings cut. I held my breath, listened for breathing. Nothing. I leaned closer again. That's when I saw the blood, oozing thickly from his head like a river of mud. It pooled round his face, seeped into the floorboards. Time stood still. And then reality hit me. He was dead. And I had killed him. Chapter 1. Alex was beginning to think her son might be evil. Evil was a strong word, but it was one she'd been thinking about a lot since her previously well-behaved 15-year-old son Milo started getting into trouble. And not just for little things either, like forgetting his homework or arguing with teachers. Serious trouble. Bullying, fighting, stealing, lying. Calls from school and the police, meetings with the head teacher followed by threats of suspension. But nothing had made a difference. When she spooled her mind back over the last few months, it was hard to work out where it all began. Was it when Alex had excitedly told him he was going to be a big brother? Or was it a few weeks later, when heartbroken, she'd had to tell him she'd lost the baby? Or could she trace it to way back before that, to when Milo's pathetic excuse for a father had upped and left and never bothered with his son again? Or maybe it was simple genetics. Alex had spent much of her childhood watching her father beat the crap out of her mum, listening to him begging for forgiveness, promising he'd never do it again, her mum forgiving him, and then starting it all over again. Surely some of the blame for Milo's behaviour could be placed at her father's door. Her husband, Patrick, Milo's stepdad, thought she worried too much. "He's basically a good kid. He'll sort himself out," he said. She hoped he was right. But there was no escaping the fact that Alex was Milo's mother, and she blamed herself. Today she was being hauled into school to speak to Milo's head teacher about a possible suspension. There had been no single inciting incident, more an accumulation of events, as though the teachers had simply run out of ideas on how to handle him. She couldn't blame them, because so had she. "Everything okay, love?" Patrick made Alex jump as he entered the room. She forced a smile as he wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. Patrick, always so solid, so dependable. Milo might not be his son by blood, but he'd been more of a father to Milo since he was 3 years old than Milo's own father had ever been. He peeled away and looked down at her, his dark eyes wide. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you to face the wrath of Mrs. Kingston?" She shook her head. "No, it's fine. You need to work." "I can take time off. One of the joys of being your own boss." He smiled. Part of her wanted to accept his offer, to tell him she needed him there. She had always needed him, whenever things had got tough. But she'd felt herself withdraw from Patrick recently, when the situation with Milo had become tricky. Was it because she knew he felt resentful about the rift Milo's behaviour had opened up in their previously solid marriage? Or was it because she was acutely aware that this was her problem, not Patrick's, and he'd been left feeling sidelined? "Honestly, I'm fine on my own," Alex said, trying to ignore the look of disappointment in his eyes as he made himself a cup of coffee in silence. "Let me know how it goes then," he said. She stood a moment longer after he left the room, the knot of tension in her belly tightening at the thought of dealing with this on her own. Then she grabbed her keys and bag and left before she could change her mind and ask for Patrick's help after all. The door slammed shut and footsteps pounded up the stairs, followed by the bang of Milo's bedroom door. Alex slumped onto the bottom stair and hung her head between her knees. Her heart felt like a bruise as her tears mingled with the raindrops from her still wet coat and pooled onto the wooden floor. That was where Patrick found her a few minutes later. He didn't say a word, just squeezed himself beside her and waited. Eventually, she looked up at him. "I take it that didn't go very well," he said, his voice gentle. Alex rested her head on his shoulder and stared at a point on the floor. "You could say that." "Want to talk about it?" She stayed silent a moment longer, letting the air settle. Upstairs, all was quiet. Milo probably already plugged into his gaming headphones. "Well, he hasn't been suspended." "That's good news, isn't it?" "I guess." Patrick's shoulder rose and fell beneath her cheek. "He's on a final warning." She let out a long, stuttering breath and looked up at him. "Patrick, he threatened to hit a teacher, and he pushed a Year 7 boy over in the playground. She lowered her voice to a whisper. "What have I done wrong?" "Oh, Allie, you haven't done anything wrong," he said, snaking his arm around her shoulders. "You know that." She shook her head. "Do I, though? Nothing seems to work, not even the threat of suspension. It's as if he's just stopped caring about anything." Patrick was quiet for a moment, considering. "You know how I feel about this." "But—" "No. Let me speak, Allie." He rubbed his face. "I know you believe the way Milo behaves is your fault, that it's in his genes or some nonsense like that. I just wish you'd listen to me when I tell you that you're wrong. Milo is not evil. He's just a kid who's trying to find his place in the world, who wants to be seen. And that has absolutely nothing to do with you or me, and even less to do with his useless, absent father." "But that's just it," Alex said. "I think you're right that it's not because of Robert. To be quite honest, I'm not sure Milo gives a damn about his father. Why would he, when he's got you? That's why I can't understand why he's still got this awful, evil streak." "Milo isn't evil." Alex sighed. "No, I know he isn't really. I just don't know what to do." Patrick pulled her to him again and stroked her arm. "Just be there for him, love, the same way you always are." "But what should I do about the trouble he's in this time? It can't go unpunished, surely." Of course not. Take his Xbox away, or ground him, or something. The most important thing for you right now, though, for both of us, is to listen to him if he needs us. We're his family. You're right. She hauled herself to her feet. I'll go and talk to him. Good idea. Just go gently, yeah? She nodded. I will. Milo didn't answer when Alex tapped on his door, so she pushed it open and peered inside. He lay flat on his back on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, headphones plugged into his ears. The tinny drumbeat was audible from several feet away. Milo? He snapped his head round and tugged an earphone out. What? Can we talk? He let out a huge huff and looked away. If you want. Alex perched on the edge of his bed, trying to ignore the debris of dirty pants, scrunched-up T-shirts, and empty crisp packets littering the floor. Milo continued to stare at the ceiling. She took a deep breath. Will you look at me, love? His eyes slid in her direction. They were so dark, just like hers, but the emptiness in them shocked her. He'd always been meticulous about his appearance, but now his dark blonde hair was in desperate need of a cut, the fringe almost covering his eyes, and a smatter of spots marched across his chin. She longed to wrap her arms around him and never let him go, but knew it wouldn't be welcome. She swallowed. What's going on, sweetheart? A shrug. I want to help you. Nothing. Milo, you were almost suspended from school. Don't think you can get away with ignoring me. I fucking hate that place. Milo! Her voice came out louder than she intended. Forget it. He turned his back, a full stop to the conversation before it had even got started. Damn it. Why couldn't she just stay calm? She stood on shaking legs. We'll talk about this later. But he'd already stuck his headphones back in, so she left, blinking back tears of frustration. Dinner was cooking, and Alex needed 5 minutes to herself. She sat at the kitchen table and scrolled through X, Facebook, Instagram. She checked the weather, flicked to a news site, the usual stories about the government imploding, prices rising, the war in Ukraine. It was all so depressing. She was about to click away when a short story in the sidebar caught her eye, or rather, the photo accompanying the story did. She held her breath and tapped on the link, already imagining the worst. Then, as the page loaded and she began to read, the blood rushed from her head. Son accused of father's murder. The trial of a Hertfordshire man accused of murdering his 53-year-old father at their family home will begin on the 20th of March at St Albans Crown Court. Samuel Jones, 23, was charged with killing Scott Jones after a fight at the family home on the 25th of January last year. Scott Jones suffered fatal head injuries following the altercation and died at the scene. His son Samuel was later arrested and charged with his murder. Samuel Jones entered a not guilty plea and was remanded in custody at Pentonville Prison in North London. She dropped the phone onto the table as though it was about to burn her. Her head span and her tongue felt dry in her mouth. This couldn't be happening. But the story still glowed at her traitorously from the screen, searing itself onto her brain so there was absolutely no denying it. Samuel, the man accused of murdering his own father in cold blood, was her son. Chapter 2. Murder. Samuel's face still glared at Alex from her phone screen. Even if she hadn't recognised the name of Samuel's adoptive father, she would have known immediately that this man was her son, because he was the spitting image of his brother, half-brother. She picked her phone up again with shaking hands and typed Samuel's name into Google. There were dozens of entries from national and local news sites. Alex clicked on one at random. There wasn't much more information than she already had, so she clicked on another and another, hungry for details. Despite the seriousness of the allegation, it didn't seem like a huge story yet, and the only other shreds of information she could glean were that Samuel had been found by his mother, adoptive mother, Yvonne, by his father's dead body. He was covered in blood. Scott's head had been bashed with a blunt instrument that hadn't been found. Yvonne had been the one to call the police. Alex dropped her phone onto the table again and paced the room. She felt light-headed, so she leaned against the worktop to steady herself and took some long, deep breaths. An urge overtook her then, to do something she hadn't done for years. She crept up the stairs and into hers and Patrick's bedroom, pulled the dressing table stool over to the wardrobe, then hauled the boxes down from the top. Grabbing the small box at the very back, she stepped down and placed it on the bed. She wiped away the dust, then prized it open, listening for footsteps, but the bass of Patrick's voice still rumbled through the ceiling from his office upstairs. She was safe for now. She tipped the contents onto the duvet. It wasn't much. A couple of photos, a plastic hospital bracelet, a teddy bear, almost brand new. She picked up one of the photos, faded now, the colours muted. The scrappy face of a newborn peered out at her, a shock of corkscrew blonde curls. But it was the eyes that took her breath away. They always had. Eyes just like Milo's. She put the photo down and picked up the bracelet, then twisted it so the writing faced her, and ran her thumb over the words. Samuel Bailey. Her Samuel. Except not her Samuel anymore. Not since he was a few days old. Alex had only been 17 when she gave birth, and poor Samuel hadn't come from a place of love. A one-night stand after leaving home at 16 to live in a series of squats and cheap bedsits, and a late pregnancy test, meant she'd had to go through with it. 17-year-old Alex had been young and naive, unsure about this invader into her life. So, when her father had insisted the boy would be better off if he was unofficially adopted by acquaintances of his, who'd had trouble having a baby of their own, she'd agreed. She regretted it the moment she cradled Samuel's tiny body, overwhelmed by the strength of her feelings for him. When Samuel had been taken away, Alex had lain in bed with the teddy bear clutched to her chest, sobbing her heart out, consoling herself that at least he'd gone to a better life. As the pain began to fade with time, she bundled everything up and put it in this box, only bringing it out when she felt sad and needed to remember her boy. And most of the time she succeeded in convincing herself that he didn't exist. But not now. 23 years later, that tiny baby boy had crashed back into her life in the worst way imaginable, as a murder suspect. If only she had someone she could talk to about it. But there was no one. Alex had never told Patrick about Samuel. She'd wanted to, so many times, but Patrick already struggled with the fact that he didn't have a child of his own. His parents were relentless bullies who worshipped the ground his older and more successful brother walked on, while criticising anything and everything Patrick did, particularly his overbearing mother. Not being a father was her biggest and most brutal stick with which to beat her youngest child. So how could Alex have admitted she had another child that had nothing to do with him, and risk making him feel like even more of a failure? If telling Patrick at the beginning had been difficult, years of failed rounds of IVF, "Have you still not got Alex pregnant, Patrick?" had made it impossible. It would have broken his heart. She hadn't told her best friend Caitlin either, choosing to keep the whole thing parcelled away where it couldn't hurt her. A decision she was now regretting. A noise from the attic made Alex jump. The scrape of a chair across wooden floors, the squeak of a door. Heart hammering, she stuffed everything back into the box and shoved it back in its hiding place. There were footsteps on the stairs, and she hurried out onto the landing, almost crashing into Patrick. "Oh, you're there," he said, smiling. I thought you were making dinner. I was. She stopped, flustered. A pain shot across her temple. Patrick lowered his head to look at her. Hey, are you okay? You look really pale. She nodded. I'm fine, just tired. She gave him a weak smile. I need to go and check on the casserole. Okay, I'm done for the day. I'll give you a hand. As they served up dinner for the three of them, Alex tried to put all thoughts of Samuel out of her mind. But it was impossible, the newspaper stories slipping back into her mind, taunting her. Her son had been charged with murder. Her other son was so prone to violent outbursts he'd been reprimanded by the police and threatened with suspension from school. And there was only one person connecting them. Alex. Chapter 3. You look terrible. Alex's best friend and business partner, Caitlin, hovered in the doorway of their office. Thanks a lot. Alex attempted a weak smile. A band of pain pressed heavy across her temple. Caitlin walked into the room, plonked a takeaway cup of coffee on Alex's desk, then sat, facing her, elbows on the desk, chin in hands. What's happened? Alex took a sip of scalding coffee, almost burning her tongue. Nothing. Why? Do I really look that bad? Caitlin peered more closely at her, nodded. You look like you've been crying. She sat back. Come on, you can tell me. Alex removed the lid from her cup and blew, watching the surface of the murky brown liquid ripple. What could she tell her? She'd known Caitlin for the best part of 12 years. Since they'd bonded at the school gates, two sobbing, snotty messes watching as their babies trudged happily into the playground, destined to become best friends forever. Alex's Milo and Caitlin's Archie. I guess that's that then, Caitlin had said, rubbing her nose the way Alex now knew she always did when she was worried or upset about something. Yeah, Alex's voice had cracked. I've spent the last few years waiting for this day to come so I could get my life back, and now all I want to do is run across that playground and drag him back home with me. Me too. Caitlin had laughed. What the fuck is wrong with us? She stuck her hand out. I'm Caitlin, by the way. I think if our boys are going to be friends, we should be too. Don't you? And that was that. Since that day, they'd shared everything about their lives, from failed IVF attempts and overbearing mothers-in-law, Alex, to caring for ailing parents and kids going off the rails, Caitlin. Then, 5 years ago, they'd set up their nursery together and become business partners as well as best friends. Alex couldn't think of anyone she'd want to work with more. Everything about their friendship worked. And yet, even Caitlin didn't know Alex's darkest secret, the thing no one except Alex and her parents knew, about Samuel. Alex wasn't sure why she had never told her. Shame, perhaps? Or was it simply that she found it easier to pretend it had never happened? Whatever the reason, she was currently regretting that decision deeply. It's Milo, Alex said, returning to their usual topic of conversation. Oh, Allie. Caitlin tipped coffee down her throat. What's he done this time? Alex flinched. The usual, more trouble at school. He nearly got suspended. She rubbed her hand over her face. I honestly don't know what to do. Caitlin rubbed her nose and hooked her ankle across her knee. Have you spoken to him? Alex shook her head. I tried to last night and again this morning, but I messed it up as usual. She puffed out her cheeks. I just don't seem to be able to talk to him anymore without it instantly turning into a row. She looked up at her best friend. I'm scared it's all gone too far. A frown creased Caitlin's forehead. What do you mean? You know, what if his behaviour has got so out of control there's no going back? What if he ends up really hurting someone, going to prison? Caitlin watched her for a moment, her face unreadable. What's brought this on all of a sudden? Alex shrugged. What could she tell her? Oh, I've got another son you know nothing about, and he's in prison, so I'm worried it's all my fault. Even thinking about saying those words out loud made Alex feel sick. I don't know. He just seems to be getting worse, Kate. Caitlin watched her over her coffee cup. Her dark eyes narrowed. Remember what you told me? Alex looked up. When? Caitlin shuffled in her seat. Back when Archie was playing up. Playing up. That was one way of putting it, Alex thought. She shook her head. Alex paused a moment, closed her eyes. You told me that no one is born bad and that his behaviour would just be a phase. She shrugged. And you were right. Alex thought back to that time 4 years ago, when Caitlin, who didn't have a partner to support her, had been at the end of her tether with Archie. Similar to Milo now. Archie had been getting into fights, stealing, losing his temper out of the blue. Things had got pretty serious, with one parent even threatening to take out a restraining order against Archie. In the end, they discovered that Archie's behaviour had been triggered by a group of boys at school, teasing him about his dad being in prison, even though Caitlin had never told her son anything about his father, Mick. No good will come of him knowing anything about that piece of shit, Caitlin always said. Alex could remember clearly how stressful it had been, but also how she had been absolutely convinced Archie would come through it. So why did this feel different? Archie was only 11 then, she said. Milo's 15. So? Caitlin placed her coffee cup on the table and leaned forward. He's still a kid, Alex. He's got you and Patrick to support him, and me and Arch. She placed her hand on Alex's arm, her fingers cold against Alex's clammy skin. Alex nodded. She felt the burn of tears behind her eyes and was overcome with a rush of love for this woman who was always there for her, no matter what. Thanks, Kate, she whispered, her voice scratchy. They sat for a moment, utterly still. Then Caitlin pulled away and swiped her coffee cup from the desk. Do you want me to talk to him? See if I can get anything out of him? You never know. He might be more willing to open up to his Auntie Caitlin. Part of Alex wanted to say no, to tell Caitlin that she was perfectly capable of dealing with her own son, but she knew that was just pig-headedness, because she clearly wasn't. Would you mind? Course not. I'll come round later if you like. Maybe Archie can give me some intel before I get there too. Thank you. Alex, you know I'd do anything for that boy. I'd do anything for you. Caitlin fixed Alex with a stare. Why don't you take the rest of the day off? We've got a quiet one anyway. There's no point in you being here in this state. The children's nursery business they ran together had gone from strength to strength in the last couple of years. It had been a long, hard slog and lots of long hours, but it was finally even more of a success than they'd ever dreamed of, with 3 nurseries in 3 local towns and a team of more than capable staff running them. It meant they could be much more hands-off than they used to be. But Alex still didn't like leaving Caitlin in the lurch. No, I'll stay for a bit, but I might leave early if you don't mind, she said. Patrick's home with Milo, and I don't like to leave them for too long when Milo's being like this. No worries. Caitlin stood and moved round to her own desk. In the meantime, I'd better get on with some work. Caitlin's desk was at right angles to Alex's, which meant they couldn't see each other's screens. Although Alex had told Caitlin she was going to stay and do some work before she went home, what she actually wanted to do was a bit more research into Samuel. Once she was sure Caitlin was completely engrossed in what she was doing, Alex pulled up a search engine and typed in Samuel's name, as well as his father, Scott's name. There wasn't much to read, no more than the few scant articles she'd read the previous day, but as she scrolled further down the page, she noticed both of their names being mentioned from time to time in other articles. Scott had been arrested 3 years ago for possession with intent to supply, a couple of charges of GBH, and a handful of other drug-related offences. There was also a small article about him being charged with fraud, something to do with a building firm he ran. She wondered briefly if it could be the same person who had ripped Caitlin off last year, who had taken a whacking great deposit, then never finished. Surely that would be too much of a coincidence. She kept reading. Samuel had also been charged with GBH after a fight in a nightclub, and on another occasion had been done for theft. Her stomach rolled over. All she could think about was Milo, who had gone from a sweet, funny, boisterous little boy to an aggressive, angry young man in just a few short months. A young man she sometimes felt nervous being around. Was this how Samuel had started? Fights in the playground, threats to punch teachers, increasingly aggressive behaviour. She could see how it could so easily escalate from that to something as serious as, what, murder? Manslaughter? She flicked back to the original article and read it again. There was barely any detail, but there was one thing that stood out now. Samuel was pleading not guilty. What did that mean? Had it been inevitable that this was going to happen from the moment he'd been born? A product of faulty genes, just like her father, always quick with his temper and his fists? Or was it as a result of his upbringing, which from the small amount she could glean, hadn't been a bed of roses? And even more importantly, was Milo on the same path as his half-brother? Or could he be helped before it was all too late? It had been nagging away at her since yesterday, but now she made a split-second decision. Heart thudding, she called up the name of the prison where Samuel was on remand and found an email address. Then, checking once more that Caitlin wasn't about to come and look over her shoulder, she emailed to ask how to get visiting rights. There were some questions she needed to ask her son. Chapter 4. The metal gates of Pentonville Prison rose above Alex's head, and she tried to ignore the tangle of barbed wire fencing that topped the high-rise walls. This was a day of firsts. Her first time visiting a prison, her first time meeting the son she hadn't seen since he was a tiny baby, and her first time telling a huge lie to Patrick about where she was spending the day. Nausea swirled in her belly, and her heart hammered an erratic rhythm. She walked towards the imposing entrance on Bambi legs. She'd been in turmoil all morning about what to wear. There was no dress code for visiting a prison. She'd also been unsure about what to bring, or whether she was even allowed to bring anything at all. She'd told the authorities at the prison that she was a writer, researching a book about people who kill family members. They probably didn't believe her. It would only take a simple internet search to discover her non-existent credentials, but they didn't seem to care all that much either. By some miracle, Samuel had agreed to add her to his visitor list too. It had all happened so fast that just a few days after sending through the request, she'd been surprised that her visit had been granted. As she waited to go through security, she avoided looking at anyone. The other people here were no doubt visiting sons, husbands, uncles, brothers, friends in this men-only prison. They were probably used to this, unfazed by it. She was one of them now, the relative of someone incarcerated behind these walls. She felt her heart skitter in her chest. She took a couple of deep breaths and reminded herself why she was doing this. It was for Milo, nothing more. If she could find out the truth about what had led Samuel to this place, she might have some idea how to help Milo, to stop him ending up here too. Keep telling yourself that, Alex. She emptied her pockets, placed her belongings on a tray, was patted down and scanned with a metal detector. A guard led her into the visitors' room. A buzz of voices, sharp clangs against metal, scrapes of chairs. Her eyes darted from table to table. Would Samuel already be here, waiting for her? She hated the idea that he would have time to study her before she was ready. What if she gave the game away before she'd even started? But no, she was led to an empty table where she almost fell into the cheap plastic chair, her palms sweating. Not daring to look up, she arranged her notebook and pen on the table, then opened the notebook and wrote the date at the top. The letters were wobbly, and she gave her hand a shake, tried to make it work properly. This was never going to work. She shouldn't be here. Then the door opened, and a man entered, and all the breath left Alex's body. It was him. Her Samuel. As he walked towards her, she took in his appearance. He was wearing a grey regulation prison tracksuit and black plimsolls, but there was still something hard about him, as though his smooth corners had been rubbed away, exposing the roughened edges below. His hair was shaved close to his head, 2 zigzag lines running down the left-hand side just above his ear. Although he was only 23, he looked older, as though he'd seen more in his short life than he should have. He stepped in front of Alex's table. She stood, almost knocking her chair over. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "No touching!" the guard barked. Samuel sat, folded his arms. Alex sat too. She didn't know what to say. It was as though her insides had been scooped out. This was her son, her boy. It was a lifetime ago, and just a heartbeat. She'd tried not to think too much about how she'd feel when she saw him for the first time, whether there would be an instant bond or a spark of love, whether she'd feel revulsion or hatred, or worse, indifference. She had her answer now. Her maternal instinct to protect him was there, washing over her like a tsunami, an overwhelming need to protect this man who was, really, no more than a stranger. "All right." Samuel's voice was a low rumble. Alex looked up and almost gasped. His eyes, the shape of his nose. He was so like Milo it took her breath away. "Hi," she said, the word a squeak. She cleared her throat. He studied her, and she squirmed beneath his intense scrutiny. The silence stretched. "I'm Allie." Alex had no idea whether Samuel had ever been told about her, so had decided to use the shortened version of her name to be on the safe side. She fiddled with her pen as she waited for him to reply. "Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me," she continued, when it became clear he wasn't going to say anything. She breathed in deeply and clicked her pen open. "You're writing a book?" "What?" He tilted his head at her notebook. "Oh, right, yes." "Pull yourself together, Alex." "Yes, I'm writing a book about patricide and—" "But I didn't—" She stopped, held her breath, as Samuel leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. All his movements were slow, considered, as though he had all the time in the world. His gaze fixed on her, laser-like. "I didn't know what that word meant when they told me about you." He shrugged. "So I looked it up. It means killing your own dad, right?" "That's right." He held her gaze a moment longer. "But I didn't. Kill him, I mean." A beat, a thump in her temple. Her knuckles round the pen turned white. "Right, yes, I know." She stabbed the paper with the nib of her pen. "That's why I thought you would be good to interview for this, I guess. Because you're being accused of something you haven't done, She trailed off, lost under his stare. The hands of the cheap plastic clock above the door ticked on. Beside them, a woman let out a screeching cackle. Samuel looked away. "It's fine. Don't matter anyway. Everyone here reckons I did it. Ask me what you want. I ain't got fuck all to lose." She glanced down at her notebook, where she'd scribbled a few questions. They all seemed ridiculous now. She turned the page and took a deep breath. "You say you didn't do it." "I didn't. Don't mean I'm not glad he's dead, though." She flinched and tried to imagine Milo speaking like that about anyone. Patrick's parents were disapproving enough of Milo, especially at the moment. They'd have a field day if they knew about Samuel. "Right. Can you tell me why? I mean, I assume you didn't have a good relationship with your father." He let out a bitter laugh, so cold she felt it in her bones. That's an understatement. And why was that, would you say? She really wasn't very good at this. She hoped he wouldn't notice. Because he was a bastard? Alex thought back to some of the stories she'd read about the trouble both Samuel and Scott Jones had been in. What? She cleared her throat. Focus, Alex. She lifted her chin. I know you've been in trouble with the law before. Yeah? He sounded suspicious. She had to tread carefully. Was that because of your father? He frowned. What do you mean? He was a drug dealer, wasn't he? Among other things, yeah. Liked ripping off old ladies by pretending to fix their roofs, then doing a runner with their money and all. She thought about Caitlin and felt a flare of anger. And did you get involved in any of his business? Nah. I've never been interested in nothing he does. Steer well clear of all that. He rested his chin on his hand. His gaze was intense, and Alex shivered. I didn't kill him, but don't mean I don't wish I had. She didn't know what to say to that, so she waited to see if he would continue. After a couple of beats, he sat back and let out a puff of air. Listen, I don't know what you need for your book thing. He waved his hand dismissively. Did I kill my father? No. Am I sad he's dead? No. Do I know who did kill him? Again, no. But none of this helps you. So what is it you want from me? She froze, certain he'd seen through her, already spotted she was a fraud. He was clearly clever. Maybe had learned through necessity to spot a liar a mile off. She stood, the legs of the chair screeching against the hard-tiled floor. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have come. From the corner of her eye, she saw a guard move towards them. Everything all right? He said, giving Samuel a hard stare. And that's when she saw Samuel, really saw him. He was just a little boy, sitting in a man's prison, lost and scared. Whether she believed he'd killed his father or not, she could see he didn't belong here. She wished she could take him away, give him the life he should have had, give him the chance to start again. Yes, sorry. It's fine. She sat back down and turned back to Samuel, who was watching her with interest. As the guard nodded and moved away, he pointed at the pad that still sat on the table between them. Shall I just tell you a bit about my dad, then? Samuel said. That would be great, thank you. He was silent for so long, she began to wonder if he'd changed his mind. But when he eventually looked up at her, she could see the pain in his eyes. He weren't always bad. When I was little, like proper little, 4 or 5, he used to take me to kick a ball around, or to the park, push me on the swings. We had fun, you know? He crossed his arms. A tattoo on his lower arm peeked out from the bottom of his prison top. He took me fishing once. I was about 9. A whole weekend together, just me and him. He'd even bought me my own fishing rod, and we sat on the riverbank and talked like we'd never talked before. Or since. He stared at the tabletop. When things were good, I thought I must have imagined the rest of it. It felt kind of nice. Normal. Alex scribbled a few notes in her notebook and waited for him to continue. The trouble was he was such a fucking charmer to everyone else. He laughed bitterly. Yeah, a right bloody charmer. But he ground me mum down till there was nothing left of the mum I knew. Something flitted across his face that she couldn't quite read. I think that's why she thinks I killed him, to be fair. 'Cause she wouldn't blame me if I had, because she's glad he's dead too. Is she? Alex's voice was a whisper. He shrugged. Actually, I ain't got a clue. Probably not. She does think I did it, but she does blame me, even if she hated him in the end, 'cause she loved him too. Fuck knows why. He slumped in his chair, as if all the energy had drained out of his body. He couldn't have been more different from the confident, slightly cocky man who'd approached the table just 15 minutes earlier. If this was the effect just thinking about his father had on Samuel, would it be any wonder if he had killed him? Alex wanted to move round to the other side of the table and wrap her arms around him. She gripped the edges of her chair to keep herself in place. "Tell me about the trouble you've been in." He ran his hand across his chin. "It's never been nothing really bad. Not like murder, anyway." He crossed his arms, defensive. "Fighting, stealing bikes, scooters, things from outside houses, that kind of thing. Fights in nightclubs. I beat someone up once because I was drunk and he looked at me the wrong way." He gave a bitter laugh. "I'm hardly a fucking criminal mastermind. I was just angry." "Angry?" "Furious, pissed off, fuming, raging, whatever." He rubbed his hand over his head. "I hated my dad and had no respect for my mum and could see my life going exactly nowhere. I ain't no psychiatrist, but you don't need to be to work out I was trying to get them to notice me." He shrugged. A wave of what? Love, pain, guilt surged through Alex. She'd always hoped she was giving her son away to have a better life, the way her father had promised, to get him away from poverty and life with a single mum and have the chance to be happy, to make something of himself. Instead, she'd given him over to a life of misery. "I'm sorry," she said, the words woefully inadequate. Around them, the hum of voices was interspersed with the occasional shout, followed by a shuffle of feet and the clatter of metal against metal. Everything about this place was so hard, so cold, and Alex wondered how anyone ever slept, or whether that was the point. Was it designed to make you go mad? Slowly, the sounds around them began to change, and she realized visiting time was coming to an end. She looked down at her notepad, where she'd written a few short sentences, hardly anything. Her stomach rolled over. She wasn't exactly sure what she'd hoped to achieve when she came here today, but she knew she hadn't resolved anything in her mind at all. Samuel stood. He towered over her, and suddenly her stomach was in knots about leaving here and never seeing him again. "Can I come again?" she blurted. "Really? I didn't give you much." "I think your story could be really interesting. For the book." He studied her for a moment, and she felt as though he could see right into her soul, see all the secrets and lies hidden there. Then he looked away and gave a small nod. "It's not as if I have anyone else coming to see us. You might as well." Then he walked away, and a small part of her cracked in two all over again. Chapter 5. Alex was still shaking as she walked away from the prison towards Caledonian Road tube station. She played over and over what Samuel had told her about his father. While Scott hadn't been physically violent the way her father had been, could a lifetime of being told you're no good, of being made to feel as though there was something wrong with you, have the same effect as watching someone beat the living daylights out of a person you loved? Or could Samuel's criminal streak just be blamed on genes? His father was bad, Samuel was bad, and now it seemed Milo was going that way too. She descended into the station, and when she sat down on the train and caught sight of her reflection in the window, she got a shock. She looked frantic, wild. What was wrong with her? This wasn't her. She was strong, unflappable. She didn't just lose control of herself at random times. She had to compose herself. She couldn't let Patrick see her like this. She took some deep breaths and slowly felt her shoulders dropping, her jaw unclenching. By the time the train pulled into their station and she'd walked the short walk home, she was calmer, her heart rate back to normal, her pulse slowed. She let herself into the house, stood in the hallway, and took in the silence. She hated to admit it, but when Milo was at school, the silence of the house felt less tense, less prickly, less like a pressure cooker about to blow than it did when he was here. She could breathe freely, At least temporarily. What sort of mother was she, to be glad her son wasn't anywhere near her? "Alex, is that you?" Patrick's voice floated down from the attic, and a few seconds later there was a thump of footsteps, and he appeared at the top of the stairs. He was in scruffy tracksuit bottoms, with a smart shirt on his top half. "Been in a meeting?" she said, smiling as he made his way down. "Can you tell?" He grinned, peering down at his half-dressed state. He leaned in to kiss her, but as he pulled away, he frowned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Why?" He squinted, then stood up again, still studying her intently. "You look like you've been crying." "Do I?" He sighed. "Have you been worrying about Milo again?" Milo. Of course she'd be upset about him. She always was. "Yeah, a bit." "Why didn't you tell me?" "There's nothing to tell." "I know you think he's your problem to sort out, but we're in this together. You know we are." Alex nodded. "I do know that. I'm not trying to shut you out, I promise. But I also know how busy you are, and I don't like to worry you." A look flitted across Patrick's face and disappeared just as quickly. "So has something else happened?" "No, just the usual." "Really?" she added, when he looked dubious. He studied her a moment longer, then turned and walked towards the kitchen. She followed him. "Good, because I wanted to talk to you about something." "Oh?" She tried not to panic. Had he found out where she'd been today? Had Caitlin said something about her not being at work? That was the problem with love.